Have you ever had someone look you dead in the face and talk to you like you were disposable? Like all the years you poured into your family, the sacrifices, the quiet prayers, the late nights, the money you didn't have but somehow found, meant absolutely nothing. Because that's exactly what happened to me when my daughter-in-law stood in my kitchen, arms crossed, tapping her manicured nails against the counter, and said, "You need to be out by Friday." I opened my home the same way most mothers do when their children are struggling, without contracts, without conditions, and without a second thought about protecting myself, because love doesn't usually come with paperwork attached. After my husband passed, I had space, silence, and a heart that still wanted to be useful, so when my son and his wife needed help, it felt natural to step in. I didn't see it as rescuing them or doing something noble. I saw it as family doing what family is supposed to do, creating a soft place to land when life gets heavy. I told myself that if I could remove even one stress from their plate, they could build something stronger together, and in those early days, they acted grateful, almost overly so. My daughter-in-law called me sweet names, thanked me in front of others, and talked about how blessed she felt to have a mother-in-law who supported young families, and I believed her because I wanted to believe her. I wanted harmony more than I wanted control, and I mistook peacekeeping for wisdom. Over time, though, I noticed how quickly gratitude can morph into expectation when boundaries are too loose. The thank yous faded, the tone shifted, and the language changed from appreciation to assumption. Decisions started being made without my input, not because I demanded authority, but because respect quietly left the room. I told myself not to be sensitive, that times change, that younger generations do things differently, and that love sometimes means stepping back. What I didn't realize, then, was that stepping back, without clarity, often invites someone else to step forward and take more than you ever offered. My generosity became invisible to her, because she had grown accustomed to the benefits without acknowledging the source. She stopped seeing the house as something I shared and started seeing it as something she owned emotionally, even if not legally. The deeper problem wasn't the walls being painted or the furniture being swapped. It was the unspoken belief that my role had shifted from provider to obstacle, from blessing to inconvenience. I had raised my son to stand on his own, to value family, and to respect sacrifice, but I hadn't prepared myself for the moment when someone else would quietly rewrite the story and place me outside of it. Kindness, when left undefended, can be reframed as weakness by someone who benefits from it but doesn't honor it. I kept giving because that's who I am, but every unchallenged moment taught her that my silence meant consent and my patience meant permission. There is a subtle danger in loving without limits, especially when the other person sees generosity as a resource to be mined rather than a gift to be protected. I wasn't trying to be a martyr, and I wasn't seeking praise, but I assumed decency would be returned simply because it was given, and that assumption cost me more than comfort. It cost me standing in my own space. When someone begins to feel entitled to what you provide, they stop seeing you as human and start seeing you as background, and that's when respect quietly exits. Looking back, I can see the small moments where I could have spoken up, clarified expectations, or gently reminded her that help does not erase hierarchy or history, but I believed love would fill those gaps on its own. I believed family bonds were stronger than ego, and I believed that opening my home meant opening my heart, not opening myself up to being dismissed. What I learned is that love without boundaries doesn't just invite closeness, it can invite control, and when generosity is given endlessly without acknowledgement, it teaches the wrong lesson to the wrong person, turning something beautiful into something dangerously unbalanced. It didn't happen all at once, which is what made it so easy to overlook, because control rarely announces itself loudly in the beginning, it arrives quietly, wrapped in confidence and disguised as efficiency. My daughter-in-law didn't start by demanding anything outright. She started by positioning herself as the one who handled things, the one who knew best, the one who spoke for the household even when no one asked her to. At first, it felt harmless, even helpful, because she spoke with certainty and people often mistake certainty for leadership. She would answer questions that weren't directed at her, make plans without checking schedules that weren't hers, and offer opinions as final decisions rather than suggestions. I noticed how conversations slowly shifted so that my voice became optional, not necessary, and then eventually inconvenient. She framed everything as what was best for their family, a phrase she used often, carefully excluding me while standing in my house, eating meals cooked under my roof. Boundaries weren't discussed, they were assumed, and those assumptions always benefited her. If something went well, it was because she organized it. If something went wrong, it was because I didn't understand how things work now. She began rewriting the rules in real time, and because I didn't challenge her immediately, those rewrites became the new standard. My son, caught between loyalty and peace, started deferring to her, not because he fully agreed, but because disagreement came with consequences I wasn't meant to see. She had mastered the art of private persuasion and public calm, presenting herself as reasonable while quietly tightening her grip behind the scenes. When I spoke up gently, she'd smile and say I was overthinking, or that I was being sensitive, words designed to make a person doubt their own instincts. Over time, she positioned herself as the gatekeeper, the one who decided what information was shared and what wasn't, what was discussed and what was dismissed. The house began to feel less like a shared space and more like a territory she was claiming inch by inch. She rearranged rooms, schedules, and expectations, always under the banner of improvement, never acknowledging that change without consent is still control. The final shift came when she stopped pretending to negotiate and started issuing statements as facts, as if the authority had already been granted simply because she acted like it had. When she told me I needed to move out, it wasn't said with anger, it was said with entitlement, the tone of someone who believed the outcome was already decided. She spoke as if my presence was a problem she had finally solved, not a relationship she was risking. There was no discussion of timing, no consideration of my circumstances, no acknowledgement of the history that put her in that position to begin with. She had convinced herself that comfort equaled ownership and that proximity to my son gave her permission to override me. The manipulation wasn't loud, it was strategic, built on the assumption that I would prioritize peace over dignity and compliance over conflict. She counted on my silence, mistook my patience for surrender, and believed my role had shrunk enough that removing me would be easy. What she failed to understand was that power taken without consent is always borrowed, never owned, and borrowed power can be revoked. Her confidence in that moment wasn't rooted in truth, it was rooted in repetition, in the fact that she had been crossing lines for so long without resistance that she assumed none existed. Control thrives when unchecked, and she had grown comfortable believing she was untouchable, that the narrative she created would be accepted simply because she spoke it first. The ultimatum was meant to seal her dominance, to finalize the shift from guest to ruler, and to cement her belief that I no longer had standing in my own life. It was a calculated move based on the idea that I would retreat quietly, embarrassed and displaced, leaving her with exactly what she wanted and no accountability for how she took it when she delivered that ultimatum. Something inside me clicked into a calm I hadn't felt in a long time, not the calm of surrender, but the calm that comes when clarity finally replaces confusion. I realized in that moment that reacting emotionally would only give her what she expected: tears, pleading, defensiveness, maybe even anger she could later twist into proof that I was unstable or unreasonable. I had spent enough years raising a child and surviving loss to know that the loudest reactions are rarely the strongest ones. So instead of arguing, I listened, nodded, and let her believe she had successfully reduced me to compliance. What she didn't understand was that my silence wasn't defeat, it was calculation. I left that house that day with my dignity intact and my mind already moving through possibilities, because panic shuts doors, but composure opens them. I didn't call friends to complain. and I didn't confront my son in a flurry of emotion. I went home and pulled out documents I hadn't looked at in years, papers that represented foresight I once thought I'd never need. I reminded myself that preparation isn't distrust, it's self-respect, and that protecting myself didn't mean I loved my family any less. The next step wasn't revenge, it was information, so I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer, not to threaten anyone, but to understand exactly where I stood. Knowledge is grounding, and as the facts became clear, so did my resolve. I learned that kindness doesn't nullify ownership and generosity doesn't erase rights, and hearing that confirmed what I already felt deep down, but hadn't fully claimed. Instead of rushing back to confront her, I waited, because timing matters, and acting too soon can unravel even the best plan. I watched how confidently she moved around the house in those final days, how relaxed she seemed, how certain she was that the story had already ended in her favor. That confidence told me everything I needed to know about how unprepared she was for reality. I used those days to organize my thoughts, gather my paperwork, and remind myself who I was before grief, before compromise, before I made myself small to keep others comfortable. There was a strange empowerment in realizing that I didn't need to convince anyone of my worth, I just needed to stand firmly in the truth of it. I also made the conscious choice not to poison my son against her at that moment, because clarity given too early can be dismissed, but clarity revealed through consequence is harder to ignore. I wanted him to see the situation for what it was without my emotions clouding the lesson. Every step I took was quiet, deliberate, and rooted in self-preservation rather than spite. I packed only what was mine, emotionally and materially, and left behind what no longer served me, including the urge to explain myself to someone who had already decided I didn't matter. By the time Friday came, I wasn't anxious, I was centered, and that shift in energy was the first real indication that the power dynamic had already changed. She thought she had cornered me, but what she had actually done was force me to reclaim authority over my own life. Staying calm wasn't easy, but it was necessary, because emotional restraint is often mistaken for weakness by those who rely on chaos to maintain control. In choosing not to react, I preserved my credibility, my options, and my leverage, and I allowed her to underestimate me right up until the moment it mattered most. There is a quiet strength in letting someone believe they've won while you're still writing the ending, and that strength carried me through every step of preparation, with a steady hand and an unshakable sense of purpose. The moment I placed the keys on the table was deceptively ordinary, almost quiet enough to be mistaken for surrender, and that was exactly why it worked the way it did. She was sitting there so comfortably, so assured of herself, scrolling on her phone like the world was already arranged to her liking, and when she looked up and saw the keys, her face softened into something close to satisfaction. In her mind, this was confirmation that her ultimatum had worked, that I had accepted my role as the one who needed to leave, the one who would quietly step aside to make room for her version of the future. I could almost see the narrative playing out behind her eyes, the story where she emerged decisive and in control, while I faded politely into the background. I spoke slowly, evenly, choosing each word with care, because I understood that this moment wasn't about volume or emotion, it was about precision. When I told her I was moving out just like she wanted, she didn't even try to hide her relief, and that reaction alone told me how little she had considered the consequences of her demand. She reached for the keys instinctively, assuming they symbolized victory, assuming they belonged to her by default, and it was in that suspended second, her hand hovering in the air, that I felt the balance begin to shift. When I calmly told her she would need them to pack her own things, the air in the room changed instantly, like a sudden pressure drop before a storm. Confusion replaced confidence, and disbelief washed over her face in slow motion, as she tried to process words that didn't align with the reality she had constructed. She asked what I meant, but her voice no longer carried authority, only uncertainty, because authority dissolves quickly when it's built on assumption rather than truth. I explained, without raising my voice or sharpening my tone, that the house had always been mine, that nothing had changed legally no matter how long she had lived there or how comfortable she had become. Watching her realization unfold was surreal, not because I enjoyed her discomfort, but because I could see how fragile her sense of power had been all along. The entitlement that once sat so confidently on her shoulders slipped away the moment she understood she had overplayed her hand. She tried to recover, to argue logistics and emotions, to bring up my son and their child, but those points, once used as leverage, no longer carried the same weight. The truth has a way of neutralizing manipulation, and in that moment, the truth was simple and undeniable. When my son arrived later and saw the paperwork for himself, the shift deepened, because suddenly the story she had told him no longer held up under scrutiny. His confusion turned into questions, and those questions turned into a clarity she hadn't anticipated, because power maintained through selective information collapses when the full picture comes into view. I didn't gloat or press my advantage. I simply stood firm, because firmness doesn't require cruelty to be effective. The keys on the table were no longer symbols of my departure, they were proof that control had never belonged to her in the first place. That realization stripped her of the certainty she relied on, leaving her exposed to the consequences of her own choices. It wasn't just about the house. It was about the mistaken belief that she could dictate terms without understanding the foundation she stood on. In trying to remove me, she had unknowingly forced a reckoning, one that revealed how quickly dominance dissolves when challenged by facts and calm resolve. The power dynamic didn't flip because I raised my voice or issued threats, it flipped because I refused to be intimidated by her confidence, and instead anchored myself in reality. Watching her face change wasn't satisfying in a cruel way, it was clarifying, because it showed me that strength doesn't need permission to assert itself, and that sometimes the most decisive moment comes wrapped in quiet certainty rather than dramatic confrontation. What came after wasn't chaos, or shouting, or some dramatic showdown. It was something much more lasting, a slow settling of reality that left no room for denial or theatrics. Once they moved out, the house felt different, not empty, but reset, like a space that had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. I didn't rush to make changes right away, because I needed to sit with the fact that I had reclaimed something more important than property. I had reclaimed authority over my own life. For the first time in years, I wasn't tiptoeing around someone else's moods or bracing myself for subtle digs disguised as conversation. The revenge, if you can even call it that, didn't come from watching her struggle or hearing about her discomfort. It came from the peace that followed and the stability I rebuilt on my own terms. I chose not to sell the house because I wanted its purpose to change rather than disappear. So I invested in it, renovated it carefully, and turned it into a source of income that required no emotional compromise. Every rent payment that came in felt like a quiet affirmation that foresight and restraint had paid off, that choosing calm over conflict had created something sustainable. Financial independence has a way of restoring dignity, not because money solves everything, but because it removes leverage from the hands of those who once used it against you. Meanwhile, my relationship with my son began to shift in subtle, but meaningful ways. Once he was no longer immersed in her version of events, he started asking questions he had never asked before, reflecting on moments he had brushed aside, because it was easier than confronting them. He didn't come back with dramatic apologies or grand gestures, he came back with consistency, honesty, and an acknowledgement that he had allowed silence to become complicity. That mattered more than any speech could have. We rebuilt trust slowly, respecting the fact that healing isn't something you rush if you want it to last. As for her, she didn't receive a lecture or a final warning, she received consequences, and those consequences did what arguments never could. She learned that confidence without foundation collapses under pressure, and that mistaking kindness for permission can cost you more than you expect. I didn't need her to admit wrongdoing or express remorse. because the outcome spoke clearly enough on its own. The lesson wasn't delivered through humiliation, it was delivered through reality asserting itself. The most satisfying part was realizing that I didn't lose anything in the process, not my integrity, not my values, and not my capacity to love wisely. I didn't become bitter or hardened, I became clearer, and clarity is a powerful form of protection. The situation taught me that revenge doesn't have to be loud or vengeful. To be complete, sometimes it's simply about removing access to what you once gave freely and letting people experience life without your safety net. I didn't walk away scorched or broken, I walked away stronger, more self-assured, and deeply aware of my own resilience. The house became a symbol not of conflict, but of transformation, proof that even painful experiences can be redirected into something productive when you refuse to let resentment lead. In the end, the true victory wasn't seeing her face fall, or watching her plans unravel. It was knowing that I had responded with wisdom rather than impulse, and emerged with my independence intact. I didn't just protect my future, I reshaped it, and in doing so, I ensured that no one would ever again mistake my generosity for something they were entitled to take.